All right, so social entrepreneurship, that's one thing I honestly think the South African government, in fact, African government as a whole should be more focused on, right, when it comes to promoting it towards the youth. So what I mean by this is that, for example, just looking at the economic status of our continent is the last leading economy, the entire continent globally, right? Africa is the last continent when it comes to socioeconomic development. So, in my opinion, one of the ways, in fact, one of the ways to really accelerate the socioeconomic development or socioeconomic landscape of this continent, but particularly in South Africa, is to promote social entrepreneurship more than just normal entrepreneurship, right? So I like using this example where I say, if you take an example of two kids, right, coming from a township or from a disadvantaged area, right, and then one is an entrepreneur and the other is a social entrepreneur. Now let's take an example where both kids go out and actually buy material to build a drone, right? Maybe they buy material in China to build a drone and then they ship it through to South Africa, down to South Africa. And then what they do is the entrepreneur, let's start with the entrepreneur one, right? The entrepreneur kid, he builds this drone and he creates it, he brands it, and then he starts selling it to other kids around the community, right? The kids get to play with that. That's very good. That's entrepreneurship right there. But then if you look at the other kid who is a social entrepreneur, and then he does the very same thing, buys all these things from China, ship them down to South Africa. But now instead of just building it and branding it and selling it as a product, he in fact addresses a social problem, but at the same time while still making profit, right? So what he does with this drone is that he takes this drone, builds it, and then he starts creating a service of drones that flies over the township or the village or whatever, right? As a way of actually, as a way of surveillance to actually look for potential crime activities that happen, such as, break-ins or robbing of people, right? And then maybe they can say the person gets to whoever downloads the app, or maybe they sort of like charge some sort of subscription fee, right? Or they partner with the government or with the police. So at least if you look at both both situations with the kids, they both solve a certain problem, right? Or rather, let's start with not even solving a problem. They both are businesses and they're both making profit, but one solves a much more needed problem that can actually prevent a lot of causes that are actually contributing to the country's economic, not I don't want to say economic downfall, but to the reason why the country is actually so behind, and the continent too, compared to the other kid who's just selling it as a luxury for other kids to play around with, right? So for me, honestly, and I think that's actually the only way that could also inspire Africans to rely on solving their own problems for themselves. And I'm not saying that we are not. Some Africans are, there are a lot of organizations that are really trying a lot, that are maybe building communities through different ways, whether it's sports, technology, or just your regular day-to-day business, right? Cash-based businesses where you sell a product or you offer a service and then you get your money in return. But I think entrepreneurship should be the one that should be promoted more across the country. I mean, yes, across the country, but especially also the continent. But since I'm speaking about the South African context now, that's just what I think. But now again, speaking of entrepreneurship though, since our government is already promoting that, I definitely can't deny that there's also a huge need for entrepreneurs. In fact, basically, there's just a huge need for economic prosperity, right? And one way to achieve that is through, of course, entrepreneurship. And there are a lot of enterprises that are also needed, right? I mean, if Vosite Maguire once made a very good example if in one of his talks about how spaza shops have been spaza shops for a very long time. And then I think he made an example with, I think his grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, where he mentioned that his grandfather started his spaza shop around about the same time that Pick and Pay was started. And of course, today, Pick and Pay is a huge corporate that's across the country with many franchises or stores, whilst his grandfather's spaza shop didn't even make it, didn't survive, right? So there is also a need for enterprises, for businesses, but definitely, I think social enterprises should be a priority to the government, to the people, yeah, basically, and just to the country as a whole, right? And there's always this talk about, entrepreneurs are born, entrepreneurs are made, or rather social entrepreneurs are born or made, whichever one. Honestly, anything you can make yourself to become anything. I think we all know that, right? Well, for me, that's what I've come to learn in my experience. Let me put it like that. I've come to learn that as much as some people are born out of maybe having natural abilities, maybe sometimes it's because of their family. You find that maybe back in, their family they had a history of business people in their family. So that thing, that kind of gene, if I should call it like a genetic kind of like a genetic quality, they've acquired it too, right? And it made it easier for them to actually try and start businesses and actually succeed. But at the end of the day, these things you can also become one. That's what I've learned. I mean, my family, for example, my grandmother is the only entrepreneur that I know of down my family line, both from my mother's side and my father's side. But now, for example, my grandmother, which I think is also another clash that happens between African, the African way of doing things. Because of course, my grandmother is very traditional. I mean, she was born like in 1936, so back in their time, they were more traditional compared to today, right? We all know that. Well, it's always said that as time goes on, Africans lose their culture, they lose um, they lose practicing more of their tradition. But what I'm trying to point out here is the Ubuntu, the Ubuntu philosophy, right? We all know that the Ubuntu philosophy is more about I am because you are, right? And because of that, it includes a lot of a person. It's more about the heart more than the mind. Because I mean, we all know that business really is mostly about the mind, and then the heart isn't really that much used when it comes to especially making deals and stuff like that. So my grandmother, for example, I mean, her store is no longer functioning now, right? Well, she's old also, so she can't still take care of the store, and there's actually no one to continue to take care of it. So, but basically, she used to sell, your regular products, your chips, your cookies, cigarettes, ice pops, your regular products that you would normally find any, black family selling. But the thing is, she would give so much credit, and this is in the village, by the way. She would give so much credit to her customers, so much so that some of them wouldn't return her money, right? And of course, this now causes her to operate at a loss, because now she would write all these people's debts down on her book. I remember very well. She would write all these debts down on her book, and then maybe one of the people would come through, and maybe they would pass in front of our yard. I'm at my grandmother's village, and maybe she would shout, "Hey, Wena, you still owe me uh 20 rand for those two boxes of cigarettes that you bought." And that maybe that man would just say, "Ah, yes, mama, don't worry, I'll pay you when I get paid. Uh, what's this? When I get my pension money, right?" And then of course, how pension money is, like how pensioners get their money in villages. There's usually a community hall, and then there's like cars that come through that give them all their pension. And then she would go there, we would take her there, and then she would meet all these men, or all the people that basically owe her, men and women. She would go after them. Some of them would funny, some of them would quickly get their pension and they would escape, right? Because they don't want to pay her back. And of course, this affected her negatively. So I think that's also another problem, because also for me, in my experience, being one of the first kids really in my family to really start a business, and even though it's still so a bit hard for me, I really love the challenge, because I can see the value that's happening within me in terms of character development. But not just necessarily that, but also just understanding business as a whole, and understanding myself as a person of value, right? But it's so difficult, because now there's this it's difficult to operate from the heart, yet business is this activity that requires you to shut your heart more and actually use your mind more. And obviously, using your mind more, you appear as cold, you appear as non-caring. And of course, you see, if you operate from the heart like my grandmother did, you tend to be taken advantage of. So that's the other thing, which sometimes would even make me question, like, isn't there like some kind of easier business model that can be made for, I guess, for Africans, based on the way that we've always been doing or carrying out tradition, like our traditions and our customs and all these things, right? Because sometimes it's really difficult. But really, that's my lesson. That's what I've learned so far. That indeed, South Africa needs to promote social entrepreneurship more. Oh, I'm just concluding, by the way, now. South Africa needs to promote social entrepreneurship more because we have just so many social problems uh, that needs to be addressed rather than it promoting entrepreneurship more because that normally deals with luxuries and not necessarily problems that really need to be solved, right? And then again, I also mentioned about how it's also quite difficult to start a business and execute a business using the Western kind of style, right? Of like executing business. And then I made an example about how my grandmother, for example, she operated from the heart, right? Because that's how she was raised. I mean, most of our great grandparents, they function more from a community based mindset. So it was always about helping, helping, helping. So a lot of people would come there and then they would take things on credit but never pay her back. So, and then of course, like, and then with my story, since I'm one of the first really in my family to start a business, having to shut them off because now I can't always connect them and just help them for free. Well, not necessarily help them for free, but like it requires me to use my mind a lot because that's where it functions, right? And I tend to appear, or at least I tend to be seen as cold and not caring enough. But so that's just the challenge that I face. It's just a little personal thing I thought I should share. But importantly, social entrepreneurship. That's what I think needs to be highly, highly promoted. I mean, if you just walk through a disadvantaged area with low cost housing, no street lights, bad sanitation. There's so many things. Those are actually so many opportunities. Littering, those are so many opportunities that, you know, are waiting to be solved. And that's actually what I've learned when I was part of my social entrepreneurship society on campus.